Hey folks, Zach Ostrom here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, with another of your Mind Your Banners, I guess, in-season specials. I'd tell you we're going to come up with a better name for them, but there's only 6 games left. I'm not sure I have that kind of energy. But this one will be looking at the homecoming matchup this weekend, Indiana against Michigan State, the first of 2 trophy games. Obviously, Indiana will play this season, and we are so pleased today to be joined by our good friend, Graham Couch, columnist for the Lansing State Journal. Graham, how are we doing?
I'm well. I'm doing better than Michigan State's football program. So,
well, I was gonna call you Indiana non-conference schedule enthusiast, Graham Couch, but that would just be a lie. We're obviously going to talk about Michigan State's season and this matchup and just kind of where things are for the Spartans. But I did want to start with something, I guess, a perspective that, when I've covered, and obviously I've covered a lot of IU football, the comparisons that IU people have tended to try and draw when building their football programs have been Gary Barnett and Barry Alvarez. But the one that I've always been fascinated by is Mark D'Antonio. And I don't think that the challenges at Michigan State and Indiana are identical, but I think D'Antonio certainly is a little bit more of a modern comparison. And while I understand that Mark D'Antonio and Curt Cignetti D'Antonio had to build under a different set of circumstances than Cignetti does now. But you witnessed, Michigan State kind of rise from being I guess you'd say a competitive program, one that it seemed like really struggled in the post-Saban period to find consistency. There were spurts of success. And then D'Antonio winds up building them into, basically just the Big Ten's 4th powerhouse team. Do you see anything, even allowing obviously for the differences in the way you would go about building a program then versus now? Are there things you see, are there parallels at all that you see between sort of what Indiana has been able to accomplish under Curt Cignetti and what you saw Michigan State do with Mark D'Antonio?
Yeah, I mean, what Cignetti's done has happened a lot quicker. I mean, D'Antonio in year 3, people wanted his defensive coordinator fired. They weren't thrilled. They went, 6-6. And so it took a while, but that was a different era where you built differently, right? You didn't have the portal. You couldn't. I do think there are things in terms of attention to detail that seem to be taken care of very well. Accountability. There is, I think they're different people in some ways, but there is a fire to both of them. There is a lack of acceptance that what has been is the way it should be, and that was something that D'Antonio kind of spoke to early and then spoke into existence, and so that so there are those similarities. Obviously, it's a very different time and how you build and how much patience people have, and Cignetti is really I think the unhelpful anomaly for the rest of college football right now, because he's creating an expectation that's hard to meet. But it's a great example of what momentum does. And I do and I have friends who are Indiana fans, and I have seen the suffering over the years, and I've been to some of their tailgates, and I do see the energy that, I remember at Michigan State, and that is a fun energy. That initial rise, there is nothing like it, and it's kind of fun to watch.
For D'Antonio, just kind of one follow there, what converted that rise? Because I think we've seen programs, sort of burn brightly, obviously in all the power conferences, and then, kind of burn out. What converted for him that rise into, the staying power of what probably the best part of a decade, maybe even a little bit more, of Michigan State is as competitive, as dangerous as Ohio State, as Michigan, as Penn State, as basically any team in the conference? What cemented Michigan State? I'm going to get in trouble for saying that way on this podcast. What cemented Michigan State kind of, once they got to that level that there was no slipping down, I guess?
Yeah. Well, they and they had that run of 36-5, and really it's a run over 6 years that was from 2010 through 15 that was pretty remarkable. There are a couple things that I think happened. One, they had, it's the identification of talent that they got. And they got, if you look at their recruiting classes like 2009 through 11, and you were to do them again, not looking at stars, because some of those guys were not big star, recruiting star guys. Those would be like the top recruiting classes in the country. And so their identification of talent, development of players, and then, they had flipped the script on the rivalry with Michigan, and an easier time to do that. But that was a really important thing to get people on board before they were winning big. But what they did really well outside of that was they didn't lose games that they historically lost. Michigan State throughout time would pull big upsets, would have big wins here and there, and could sometimes go toe-to-toe with you, but then would lose the next week to Purdue, or whatever it was. And that stopped. Like D'Antonio's record, and I don't have it in front of me, but 11-3 or whatever it was. D'Antonio's record around the Michigan game, around the Ohio State game was just amazing. So he brought a level of consistency that changed what that program had always been. And so when they won big games, it wasn't like the next week there was this go out and party and let down. And that's really, I think, the key, even when you sort of finally have the goods to do it, if your program hasn't been there to have the discipline to be consistent week in and week out. Because that's what Saban never was able. In '99, Saban's last year at Michigan State, they beat Michigan, were undefeated. They beat the Tom Brady, Drew Henson Michigan team, and then lost 2 straight weeks to Purdue and Wisconsin. Now that was like, Drew Brees, Purdue. It wasn't a bad Purdue version, but Saban will tell you to this day, they were not ready to handle the success, and they had the type of team that could have done anything. So that's what changed. And D'Antonio did that, better than anybody. And he took advantage of some timing. Ohio State was not what Ohio State has been lately. Michigan, although they were at the end, Michigan was down, and that helped as well.
Well, that's a natural segue into this weekend, because I think Curt Cignetti is, if you listen to any of his answers to questions on Monday that were essentially answers that really said very little about the questions that were asked and said a lot about what Cignetti wanted to talk about, which was, I think, complacency in its various forms. That feels like kind of what's on trial a little bit for Indiana this weekend. Obviously a big win last weekend at Oregon. They'll be favored this weekend, comfortably so, I think, in a lot of corners. But I think Cignetti is very, sort of wary of that kind of letdown. I want to start by just talking about this season for Michigan State. And I think you teased toward the top that things have not gone great. And it struck me that, I got to watch a decent bit of that USC game. I was awake a lot later than I should have been. I got to see some bits and pieces of the Nebraska game, and in both games, it felt like you saw the concept for Michigan State. Like you saw why it could work, but then it didn't, if that sort of makes sense. And then obviously UCLA last weekend was probably a bitter pill to swallow, although we should all consider the fact that UCLA might have invented football and only just discovered that fact in the last 2 weeks. But, just kind of, where are things in year 2 for Jonathan Smith at a time when, as you kind of alluded to earlier as well, maybe there is a little bit less patience, a little bit less kind of time.
Yeah, I think there's a chance if this goes really poorly this weekend that this is Jonathan Smith's last game at Michigan State, and so that's the just the dynamic and how different it is from what's happened in Indiana in 18. This will be 19 games. People are the fan base is largely all out on Smith and his staff right now. You got a new athletic director. Who you got a president who was hired just after. None of these guys are tied to Smith, which is one of the reasons the buyout on his end to get out of it at one point was drastically reduced when Alan Haller, the former athletic director, was fired. He could get hired away. Now he's not performed to the point that he's going to get a big job out of this, but Michigan State would owe him a lot of money on their end if they were to get rid of him. What's happened is, and it's happened pretty quickly here, because the Nebraska loss the USC loss was not one that was, I think, all that discouraging, other than like the defense just looked like a sieve, and they needed to get that corrected over time for people to really identify with the program. But the offense looked good. They lose 45-31 on the road at USC. There's no shame in that. They battled in the second half, got it to within a score late in the third quarter. Looked like a team that had a receiving core and a passing game and quarterback that could make them competitive and give them an edge against teams that otherwise had advantages. You fast forward to the Nebraska game, and it's just a disaster. All coming off a bye, they had just made a ton of mistakes. Special teams, which have been their strength, block, punt, all this stuff. Just the whole thing looked like a mess. The offensive line is sort of falling apart, and pass protection that seeps into Aiden Child's confidence. The whole thing is awful. They look poorly prepared and poorly coached, and in a game where Nebraska is not that good. And it was clear, like Nebraska, they were at least as good as Nebraska. And so they lose a game. They lose that 50-50 game. It makes the UCLA game important. Now, UCLA is different. You catch them at the wrong time. I wondered, though, given what they had just done to Penn State, if they had been drunk till Wednesday and then flying across the country for what was a 9 a.m. local time start, and it might go really well for MSU. In the first drive, Michigan State goes right down and scores. Looks very good. Holds them to a field goal on the next drive. They had a stop, then a score, then held them to a field goal. And then there's this moment in time. They're at their own 34-yard line facing 4th and inches, Michigan State. And they go for it. Sort of a desperation move, but they've been really good on 4th downs, running sneaks with Childs and other things. They audible out of a sneak because of the defense into this slow developing toss into the right side of the line that, gets overwhelmed, doesn't work. They turn the ball over, and you could just feel the energy change, and you could feel UCLA say, hey, wait a second, they're just going to give it, let's take this. And UCLA's energy changed. And the whole game, it was just a really bad coaching decision, really bad moment for the program. And it was a game that they just couldn't lose. They could not lose that game. They have not had enough moments in the 2 years he's been there where you look at a game that's 50-50 and say, boy, they won that because of the coaching staff. They won that because they executed well, or they were just flying everywhere. They had one game last year against Iowa, but there are now 4 games that are really biting them. It's Michigan last year, where Michigan was not that good. They had an early lead, some poorly coached game on some decisions, and then Smith did not seem to understand the rivalry. And it's hard when you come from outside to get just how venomous that is and how important it is to people. Then they lose a bad game at the end of the year in front of an empty crowd to Rutgers, just get hammered at home. And then, but, it's year one. These last 2 weeks, though, have been, this was supposed to be a staff that brought competence. And I think that's where they've lost people. The only way out at this point, to me, is they've got to do something that's unexpected. And that doesn't mean beating Indiana. But the key, if they're competitive enough this week and he keeps coaching as they go on, they play a Michigan team that's not great offensively. They could win that game. They could. Minnesota's not great. That's a road game. Penn State's now a mess. They visit, so who knows what that is. Like, they've got to get to 6 wins, I think. And that just seems it's hard to picture that based on what we saw last week.
You mentioned 2 things, I think sort of, I guess, yeah, pretty much 2 things in there that I've looked at really through probably the last 2 years, but certainly this season and this Indiana team, when I'm trying to sort of stack them up against an opponent. And one was the offensive line, and the other one is, kind of like not showing maybe that defense that Michigan State sees as sort of its identity historically, right? That Michigan State defense has played you go back to the 70s and 80s, the great Michigan State teams just were so physical and so tough. I guess the first one I want to ask you about is that offensive line, because Indiana obviously has, I don't think it's unfair to say it at this point, one of the best defensive fronts in the country. Michigan State's allowed 15 sacks and 46 tackles for loss. I don't know how much of the Oregon game you got to watch. I think, Indiana probably even surprised people who, like me, who've watched them all season with how well they controlled the line of scrimmage in that game. I mean, it's sort of like it's a very easy question to ask, but how much of that is a concern in your mind for Michigan State going into this weekend? Because you talk about it can affect Child's confidence. I think I saw that am I right in saying he's questionable for this week?
Yeah, I don't even know 100% if he's going to play.
Yeah.
No,
but just kind of like how does that manifest itself if Michigan State struggling the way that Oregon did, the way that Illinois did to protect the passer. And
Yeah.
frankly, at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, it's a big problem. And, it speaks to never believe a coaching staff when they say they have great depth, because before the year, that was the talk. They couldn't decide on, the 5. They were rotating guys, and they had 6, they had 10, and they had 7 or 8. But they've lost a couple of guys to injuries for the season who I think were good players and difference makers up front. And they have not had the depth to overcome that, especially on the right side at right tackle. And that's it's been an enormous problem. And it's seeped into Childs, whose play is, he was really ascending for about the 3 games before this. And, a guy with immense physical tools and it was starting to, read coverages better and hang in there. And, it just looked like a guy who was getting it, second year as a starter and all that. And that, he's lost his confidence in that group. And he's got a lot of athletic ability, so can be quick to drop his eyes down. And like in the last game, it was very clear. There were times where, he would force into the first read, even though the second read, if he had just waited a split second, was coming wide open, and there were, there's just, it's not great. I don't know, the backup, this kid Alessio, who's a redshirt freshman, who's shown some things, but he is not, this would be just a really tough place to do it. And he doesn't quite have the mobility that Childs does, which can be important when you're up against it a little bit. It's led to bad quarterback play. And I mean, Childs has made some mistakes, and this is, this ultimately his decline in play might be what sinks this staff to some degree. Now, they've got other issues all over the place. But what I mean is that was a strength for a minute. And now that passing game is not. I thought there was a moment after the USC game where I was pretty sure Boston College and USC that, yeah, they were going to give up a lot of points. They were going to lose some games, but you were going to have to score to beat them, because they could walk in anywhere and on the right day put up 30. And you just don't see that now.
The other thing I want to ask about the line of scrimmage, and this is really more unique to this year's Indiana team, if we're talking about the two Signetti teams, essentially, and it does feel like we're living almost in a world where a football program was reborn starting at the beginning of spring camp 2024 here sometimes. But this team has been a lot more explosive rushing the ball this season. Not so much the last 2 games. Obviously, Oregon and Iowa are 2 of the tougher run defenses in the league. Certainly, Oregon at Oregon, you can understand, but in the same breath, Indiana, even in those games, was able to run it well enough when it needed to, and better than a lot of opponents, had been able to in those games. Michigan State's run defense, I guess, is a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, 4 of their 6 games, they've allowed 97 or fewer yards, but 2 of their 6 games, they've allowed, if I'm doing back of a cocktail napkin math, 527 yards between them. That's USC and UCLA. They've also allowed 8 rushing touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. And for all the justifiable talk at Indiana around Fernando Mendoza, so much of what I think when Mendoza has had his best performances, whether it's overall games or just in general, has really kind of provided the platform, is Indiana's just been a lot more explosive in the run game than it was a season ago. Like, when it's gone well, what's worked for Michigan State, and like, essentially, I guess that it's a loaded question, forgive me, but especially if you look at these 3 Big Ten games, which is the outlier? Is it Nebraska, or is it the 2 LA teams?
Oof. Nebraska's offensive line just isn't very good. So, I mean, Nebraska's not a great team, but there are other teams like them in the like the Michigan State team that existed earlier can compete with a lot of their schedule. I don't think this week, but a lot of their schedule. I mean, and Michigan State's had some key injuries on defense and some untimely ones that have hurt. Again, sort of the depth's overstated there, because you see certain guys go down, and it's hard to say. I think right now they are a defense that the thing that was different about UCLA is there was a lack of tenacity, a lack of will, it looked like. Now they will tell you it was just some guys trying to do too much, being in the wrong spots, and so that becomes demoralizing. I think UCLA stands alone. And now I think part of the problem is, it's hard to. So UCLA is a difficult one because it's hard to know exactly what UCLA is right now. I mean, that's the UCLA team I watched early. I watched them play New Mexico. I watched them play some of the Utah game. Like, that is That was a really bad football team. The UCLA team we've seen the last couple of weeks, it's like, and then you think, well, right before that they lost to Northwestern on the road, but Northwestern just put the nail in the coffin to James Franklin. Like maybe they're not even horrible. Like you start to have all these questions about things, and because UCLA looked all right, but I just think MSU's collectively defensively has zero pass rush and has not been consistent stopping the run and won't be the rest of the year. Their defense is, unless they can find a way to get to the passer, it's just going to be ripe for the taking for somebody like Indiana in just about every facet.
You touched on it a little bit, but I did just want to ask about just like what your sense is on Childs. I mean, like I agree with you in the round that you can see the player there, right? Like I even felt like you could see that with some of the throws he made, especially early in that game in East Lansing last year, where you just sort of thought like, there it is. And the numbers, had trended better this year. I mean, he had, I looked at this earlier, he had 13 touchdowns to 11 interceptions last season. He'd thrown 9 touchdowns to just 3 interceptions this season. His completion percentage had ticked up a little bit. But I guess number one, where do you think he is for this game, as much as you can kind of read those tea leaves? And number two, how much has he improved versus a year ago? Is it just getting a year older, or have there been some moments when you sort of thought like, hey, he couldn't do that, last year?
Yeah, no, there were definitely moments, and he talks about them. He brought in a quarterbacks coach to work with him instead of having the offensive coordinator, both roles, because I needed somebody really to hold him accountable and work on certain things, which you saw when he decided to run, what he could see from defenses. They talked about, last year they'd say, well, what did you see? And when he came off the field, and he couldn't really tell them sometimes, and now he could, and so there was definite progress and growth. And I've seen quarterbacks lose confidence before. It's a hard thing to get back. It'll be interesting to see if it can happen this year. I don't think as a quarterback prospect, people should give up on him, whether it happens at MSU or anywhere. I mean, we saw, I'm not saying he's going to be Jalen Daniels, but like if you saw the progression of his career from Arizona State to what he became at the very end at LSU, just a completely different player with a lot of tools that, and then he was ready. And, Childs is still a guy who I believe just turned 20. I mean, he was a 19-year-old junior when this year started. So in his second year, I mean, he's a young quarterback still. The problem is there are certain things, his deep balls inconsistent, and there are certain things that I think are just going to be traits. In terms of whether he plays, I really don't have a great feel for it. And I don't know that sometimes you can tell. He was asked a lot about it this Tuesday and Monday, and especially Tuesday, just the way players and his coordinator would talk. Sometimes you can read the tea leaves, like they're planning for the other guy. It's a hard thing to read, and so I don't know what, and I don't even know. I think they're better off if he plays, because he can still do some things with his feet and in moments that really help you, and when you don't have anything else. But Alessio has been better on schedule, better with quick passes, and when you have the weapons they do at receiver, better at getting the ball to Nick Marsh, who's their big NFL guy, right? I mean, Nick Marsh is a bona fide first-round talent. Now he's only a sophomore, but and teams have tried to take him away, and they have good other receivers, and Amari Kelly, and Childs has struggled to get those guys the ball. So, look, I do not think this game will go well for MSU. It's hard for me to see it. If they do it, then that really does say something about this staff and this team and other things. But it's very hard to see how he has more time than he's had in recent weeks to throw, how that looks any better, how they're able to run the ball, and how they're able to hang in there at the line of scrimmage. And they need to do that to have any sort of shot.
I guess the last thing I wanted to ask you, and if you have a prediction, I'll take it, but I almost just more wanted to ask about vibes, because I feel like when you and I have talked about Indiana going into these games, it's kind of been in the other direction, right? In years gone by, in terms of, just where is the fan base, or where does it feel like the project is, or whatever. And I feel like you've sort of talked about it without like specifically referencing it in a few different ways, but just what is the feeling? And I know this has always been, I recognize that we can call this a rivalry game. Both teams have other schools in the conference they consider more heated rivals, but it is still a trophy game. I mean, Illinois calls Indiana a rival, but they don't play for anything, and Indiana doesn't acknowledge the rivalry. So I think there is still something about this series that's a little bit different. Like, is there kind of is there juice around this in East Lansing, or is this,
it's a death march right now. I mean, I think that, there are some people who are just sort of coming to that realization. And look, I really like Jonathan Smith personally. I think this is too bad. I thought it was a good hire at the time. He's not somebody who emotionally connects with people very easily in terms of, real fire, and not being from the area. I think it took him a minute, but I think there's some talent on the staff. I think they clearly got it going at Oregon State. They've been pretty accountable this last week or so. Brian Lindgren, the offensive coordinator, just talking. I mean, they get why people are angry, and they would, and so I think they're the type of people you want leading your program. It just doesn't look like it's going to work, and a lot of people are just ready to turn the page. At some point, you're going to have to stick with the coach, because one thing that's going to happen, even to Kurt Cignetti at some point, will be, I think, the difference. You talk about the D'Antonio era and sustaining it, is there's so much fluidity in college football that even the best programs and the best coaches, I don't think going forward, are going to have year over year over year where it's just a build or just sustain. You're going to have a random year where you're 5-7 or 4-8 because you didn't get the portal right and the culture of the guys you brought in didn't fit, or something went wrong. And that doesn't mean the next year is going to be bad. It's not the end of the program. It's just that year, that portal, that thing. And I think, fans throughout college football are going to struggle with this. And I think, the problem is that you can all, if you're a place like Michigan State, you can accept that if there was any sign of the high end stuff too, and they haven't had any of that. So I think it's just reached a point where there's just no belief. And last week, when it looked like guys sort of quit, and that's a tough word, but even Jalen Berger. I mean, they UCLA had two guys on their team who played at Michigan State, were transfers at big days. Jalen Berger had 3 touchdowns and said it looked like Michigan State didn't want to play anymore in the third quarter. They had a defensive end, Anthony Jones, who I think played at Indiana maybe too.
Yeah, he did. Yeah,
been at four different places, and he had the big stop on the 4th and inches for UCLA. I mean, he knew exactly what was coming. Now he might know that. He knows that. I think this is his 4th Big Ten school, so he might know that at every Big Ten school.
Yes, he's gone coast to coast more than once. Indiana got him from Oregon, so
he knows everybody.
His career is basically the commercial. Yeah, like his career is essentially the Big Ten Network commercial at this point. So
there's that. But yeah, and so what I think is going to happen is Cignetti is not one to lighten up on people, and I think it's potentially pretty ugly. The only chance Michigan State to me has to keep this within the spread, which is like 27 points from Vegas, is to have long enough drives, consistent enough drives, and they've shown moments of that, where Indiana is not on the field offensively as much as I think they're going to be. So if score wise, I think you're looking at something like 42-13, in that range, and it just feels like that's what's coming.
He's Graham Couch, columnist, Lansing State Journal. Graham, thank you so much for joining us again. If you're listening to this now, we did only record this on Tuesday. It's not quite like when we had James Crepea on, and we just completely missed the rise of future 3-time national champion UCLA. But Graham, thank you so much for joining us here on Mind Your Banners. We'll be back on Saturday with our post-game show from Memorial Stadium. But between now and then, for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you soon.